Hello, this is the Leakbuster 2 video on 3-betting. I have a lot of material to cover in this video, so we're just going to jump right in. First of all, why would you want to 3-bet to begin with? There's several different reasons. Among them are increasing the size of the pot. So, especially against weaker players, if you can do this to isolate them with your strong range of hands, and if you can find a size, a maximum size that they will call, and you can get them heads up, that's ideal. The money will get into the middle post flop a whole lot quicker. So when you're 3-betting, all the sizes here become exponential. That should be pretty straightforward. The more money that goes in pre-flop, that means the larger bets you can make on each subsequent street. You're forcing your opponent to make a decision, which is what we always want to do in poker. We want to make the decisions as hard as possible on our opponents. Around half the time, sometimes even more, your opponents will fold and you'll just pick up the pot. Some of your opponents will call with weaker and marginal hands. So when you do this with your value hands, you can get more money into the pot when you have an equity advantage. As we kind of alluded to a moment ago, you can isolate a weaker player. This is great against some of your fishy or just bad players in general. Especially when you can do this in position, you have position on a weak player in a re-raised pot. That's an ideal scenario. And lastly, to re-steal versus a light opener. So I'm going to do this with some of your weaker hands sometimes and just get them to fold outright and win the pot when you have a hand that you don't really want to just call with. Next, let's cover some 3-bet sizing. So suggested sizing on the minimum side is about 2.5 to 3 times your opponent's open raise. On the larger max side of that is about 4 to 4.5 times. That's very large. Ideally, you just want to pick one 3-bet sizing and stay consistent with that. Usually 3 to 3.5 times your opponent's open raise is a good standard. That being said, you don't want to play just robotic poker. There are going to be plenty of times when you should be deviating your 3-bet sizing, but you want to use common sense when you're doing it. So if, for example, I want to 3-bet isolate a weaker player, and I'm just doing that to basically isolate them with a non-polarized hand, something like a king 10 suited. I'm in position. I do that with 2.5 times because I want to keep them in the pot, but I also want to show aggression and take control of the pot and make sure that I don't get any other players in the pot with me. I do that. The hand goes to showdown. Other players at my table, especially the regulars, see the hand. Now I'm going to want to be careful and make sure that if that situation occurs again with a weaker player, that I'm not tipping off what my range of hands is likely is. So in that situation, I would switch more to my regular sizing, or perhaps would do that with one of my bigger non-polarized hands, like my premium hands, to get one of my regular players to react and make a big misstep there. So just the bottom line is use common sense. There's even situations against regulars until you build a history that you can deviate between these raise sizes. But I would highly suggest to staying in the 3 to as much as 3.5 times size. Now when you're at a position, you generally want to 3-bet a little bit larger. You're looking for folds slightly higher percentage of the time. Especially in today's games, people fold a whole lot less to 3-bets, especially when they're in position. So if you are doing this with a polarized range, which we'll go into more later in this video, what that means and what that looks like. But if you're doing that with a re-steal hand, like let's say King 9 suited or something, you're primarily looking for folds. If you get a call, you want to have a hand that you have some equity with, but you increase your fold equity obviously by increasing your raise size. So just find something, especially if this is against a regular, that you're sticking within a consistent sizing, so you're not giving away the range of your hands. And also, When you do raise larger, it cuts down your opponent's positional advantage because stack sizes become smaller. So that's a good reason to do it. Now, that doesn't mean you always have to do it. And in fact, the deeper you are, the less you should be three betting more out of position because your opponent's hand range is going to go up in value the deeper you are when they have position on you. So if you three bet with a value hand like ace queen, you shouldn't increase that size when you're deeper because your opponent's range is going to consist of a lot of suited connectors and things of that nature, and just in a pot that could potentially be larger, they're going to have an equity advantage. So you just want to actually keep somewhere to around same sizing that you would in position when you're out of position in those deeper stack cases. Now, when you're considering a three bet, you want to make sure that you're looking at your position. Are you in position, out of position? Most of your three bets should be coming from in position, with the exception of the small blind in today's games. Uh, don't want to be cold calling a whole lot in the small blind. A lot of big blinds are very squeeze happy nowadays. So you definitely want to take more of a three bet or fold from the small blind. So your small blind three bet numbers could be pretty close to your button, but your button should be your highest three bet position. The type of opponent that you're against, is this someone who folds a lot or doesn't fold a lot? What's your goal in making the three bet? So know that, and how you expect your opponent to react. Are they super tight? And you should really only be three betting them with very premium hands because they're only opening very premium hands. That leads right into the pre-flop raisers range by position. So obviously, they're opening from early position. They're going to have a stronger range versus later position. That should be pretty straightforward. Um, what your opponent's calling in 4-bet ranges. So, to really get an accurate read on your opponent's 4-bet range, you do need a good amount of hands and data. So, if you're looking at this in a HUD online, I wouldn't recommend taking too much stock in those numbers until you have a very, very large sample size. I mean, 50,000 plus hands on your opponent. Unless something is like really dramatically outside of the norm, they have a 4-bet range of like 10 and, a few thousand hands, then they're probably 4-betting a lot. Mostly look at how often they're calling and folding to a 3-bet. That normalizes a little bit quicker. Clearly, it still takes some time because if you play 1,000 hands with someone, how many situations do they get where they have to face? Are they going to, call or fold to a three bet? That takes some time. So and also very important, always think about what you've been doing lately, what your table dynamics are looking at, how active you've been. If you've been really active and you're considering 3-bet bluffing in a situation, especially if you've been involved in pots with that particular player, you might want to be much more cautious. And conversely, if you've been just having a bad run of cards, you've been playing very tight, then you could probably look to open up your bluffing range a little bit more. As I alluded to earlier, you want to polarize your three betting range. So, what does polarizing mean? It means to get your opponent to have completely conflicting and opposite opinions about what you're doing. So, for example, we're going to three bet the very top of our range, which as an example would be ace queen plus, tens plus, and we want to three bet some on the bottom of our range. As an example, king 7 suited plus, ace 3 suited plus, queen 8 suited plus, and so on. And ideally, we would want to take, let's say, the very top 4% of our range, which is our value play of our range here, ace queen plus, tens plus, and get about 4% of the what we'd consider the bottom of our range that we'd want to do. So we'd have a total of 8%. 4% are value hands that we wouldn't mind getting it in with, or getting at least in a re-raise pot and so on, versus the very bottom of our range that we're looking to get mostly folds out of. So our opponent doesn't know, are they doing it with the value hand or are they doing it with bottom of the range. So you can become unbalanced in that sense where you could have only three bet, maybe say 2% of your range or something, and then another 7% is the bottom of your range. Well, in that case, then your opponent knows most of the time when you three bet, you're full of it, and they could four bet bluff you or use this, use that information to create a strategy against you. So ideally, we want to polarize our range and create an equal amount of value hands and an equal amount of at the bottom of our range. Now, having said that, in some games, especially still today, you can get away with having a higher percentage of the bottom of your range. So you could three bet as much as 10% and have 4 or 3.5% of that as a value range and majority of that as the bottom of your range because players don't tend to really figure that completely out for a while. Um, to really see someone's true three betting range, it takes quite some time. I'm sure if you've noticed you had a HUD up, you have a couple hundred hands on your opponent, they might have a three bet range of, 2% or conversely 15%. But really, over time, that might converge closer to 7 or 6%. You don't quite know yet. So, anyways, that's what polarizing your three bet range looks like. So what kinds of hands should we look to three bet? We break this down into four different categories. Like we just said, our premium hands, ace, king plus, jack plus, that's our tier one. That would be from any position. We're pretty much always three betting those. Um, Occasionally for deception or flat call. Our tier two, which mostly our value hands, we look to three bet them. Um, most of the time, but not always. So that would be eights through tens, ace queen plus, and some of our suited connectors. Mostly when our stacks get deeper, mostly in position, because our suited connectors can make very big hands. So when you're deep, you have a lot of different ways to win pots by making just really big hands, and additionally, for as bluffs, you can turn those into bluffs much easier. Our tier three, which we consider our merged range of hands. So these are hands that typically can make, strong top pair, two pair hands. They're harder hands to make straights and sets with, minus the 10 jack through queen jack hands. But as you can see, king jack, queen jack, ace 10, ace jack, hands like this that are strong top pair hands, generally speaking. Some of them can also be more of our mid-range hands that can make some straights, but in general, they they play well heads up, so we would three bet those to isolate. And then our bottom tier four, which is our polarized hands that we just talked about: ace deuce suited, king nine suited plus, queen eight suited plus, jack eight suited plus. Those are hands that we're mainly looking to three bet as a bluff and to get folds from. So let's talk about what three betting in an actual game versus some of the regulars at your table look like. So regulars usually fall into about three different categories, and regular is defined by somebody who plays a lot in your games and plays a reasonable range of hands. So in online games, their VPIP is going to be somewhere in the 20 to 27 to 28 range. In six max games, slightly tighter in full ring, with relatively close pre-flop raise percentage. You know, Beyond that, some of the other stats might differ, and they usually go into three categories, which are going to be your weak regulars. They usually have some pretty glaring holes in their game, either pre-flop, but generally mostly post-flop. Your decent regulars who play a pretty standard game, but they play fairly predictable. They still have a lot of exploitative areas. And then your solid or good regulars who play a really tight, good game. They don't have a whole lot of holes pre or post flop. So obviously you want to stick to getting into most of your pots against the weaker regulars when you are playing against regulars, and some of the decent regulars, and the solid regulars. You at least want to hold your own, right? Ideally, course, you want to crush everybody you're playing against, but just looking at it from, you know, a overall umbrella of the kinds of regulars you're going to face. Um, so let's go over kind of a basic example. So say it's 100 big blinds, effective stacks in a 6 max cash game. Your solid regular opens to 3 big blinds. These are what we define as a solid regular: 26 VPIP, 23 pre-flop raise, 3.2 aggression, and you 3 bet on the button to 9 big blinds. What is your opponent's likely raising range pre-flop from each position? So we want to take a look at the solid regulars raising range by position, because that's how we're going to analyze any hand. We first start with looking at what their pre-flop ranges are, and then slowly, as we get more information, we move to the flop, turn, and river, and gain information. We narrow that range so that we can bring that as close down to a narrow as possible of a range and make the best decisions that we can. So by position, a solid good regulars open raising range, and this is just a general overview. This is not how every single player open raises, but this is roughly what it'll look like for someone playing 26% of their hands overall and raising 23% of them. So under the gun, you have deuces plus, and some tables they may be cutting out some of the bottom of this and adding other hands elsewhere, like more suited connectors, but roughly 18%. They'll be open raising, maybe slightly less or slightly more. Hijack or middle position, similar, but we're adding a few more hands here. Some ace 10 offsuit, going a little bit lower in some of the suited connectors and offsuited hands like king 10 offsuit, but roughly 21%. Again, maybe slightly more, slightly less. Cutoff, adding a whole lot more hands. Deuces plus, ace suited, deuce suited plus, jack 9 suited, 10-8 suited. Some one gapper suited connectors, some even off-suited connectors. So we're getting closer to 27. Again, could go as low as 24, as high as 30 something percent. But that's a rough range. Button, I think a standard open button range here. We're going to go anywhere from 44 to 50%. Some players even more. And small blind is going to be very similar to the button, maybe cut off some of the bottom of that range, just depending on who's in our big blind. But that's roughly what a solid player's opening range is going to look like by position. So you're taking that into consideration when you're looking to 3-bet. So am I 3-betting for value, or am I 3-betting as a bluff? And that's going to change by where they're opening. If they're opening from under the gun and you're 3-betting with something like let's say ace jack suited, you're primarily doing that as a bluff against the range. Now, if you look at that same hand and they're opening from the button and you're in the small blind, then you're doing that for value. So, what hands you're 3-betting them with is going to depend on whether you're doing it for value, bluff, based on where they're opening. Once you decide you're going to 3-bet, now your next question should be what is my opponent's 3-bet calling range and 4-bet range? So if you 3-bet a solid regular from the button, their under the gun calling range should be something like ace queen suited, ace king, 9s plus, give or take some hands, hijack, adding a few more hands, like ace queen offsuit, 8s plus. May have some high suited connectors in here. Nothing is set in stone. These are general ranges. Every opponent is going to have a slightly different range here, but these hands will definitely be in their range. So you start with those and you add or subtract depending on information as you get as the hand goes. Cutoff, again, we're just adding a few more ace jack offsuited and offsuited, some more suited connectors, may have some higher and some mid suited connectors in there. And even though it doesn't exactly apply to this scenario, small blind would be an example. Adding some ace 10 suited plus, some smallest side would be sixes here, and king queen offsuit and suited. once you've established what your opponent's 3-bet calling range is, their 4-bet range is going to be very similar. It's just going to add in a lot of these hands. The only difference is they're going to have some more bluffs. So they'll take some of the highest end of that value range from each position and add in some bluffs and likely cut out the middle of that range. So something like from the cutoff, they might remove ace jack offsuit. Some of their suited connectors might look to fold those instead of looking to turn those into 4-bet bluffs. But everything, it depends on your table image, how often you've been 3-betting, and so on. But as a general rule, they'll tend to cut out some of those hands. Maybe some of the hands they might look to 4-bet bluff that have a lot of blockers like king, queen, and what have you. Blockers meaning that you are less likely to have one of those cards in your hand. So that bodes well for their if they're turning that into a 4-bet bluff for their fold equity. And something else to keep in mind when you're sizing your 4-bet, just kind of throwing that in there, that the more aggressive the games are, the smaller your 4-bet sizing should be. It should never really go beyond 23% of your overall stack size. If you're and that's just in relation to roughly 100 big blinds. If you're deeper stacked, you don't want to size your 4-bet to 22 or 23% of your stack. But just in general, 100 big blinds, you want to not size it to a point where you can't get away from your hand, so that you can include some 4-bet bluffs, and your opponent's going to do that as well. Let's take a look at a quick example of 3-betting a regular from the button with a merged range hand. This is not our top tier and not our bottom tier, and this is a 6 max cash game, 2 players sitting out. Regular opens in the cutoff to 2.5 times the big blind, and we 3-bet with king jack, 8 times the big blind, a little bit over 3 times that are opening, 3.2 to be exact. And action folds back around and we pick up the pot. Now, it's not horrible to flat call here, except for the fact that in this particular case the blinds are very aggressive, so you're going to get squeezed a lot in that situation. So it's an argument for 3-betting. It's not horrible to flat and then call their squeeze, but ideally it's nice to pick up the pot here or ISO this player. Depends a lot on dynamics, but it's a situation where you're looking at who's in the blinds, what's my hand here. It's strong, and normally plenty strong to just flat call, but I 3-bet so I can not deal with possibly squeezing and playing a really big pot, even though I have position. So it's not the worst case scenario, but not ideal. And I also have the added dynamic of adding extra pressure to that player that's on my right, which eventually is another strategy tactic you can use in your cash games, where you can get them to react at the wrong time if you're continuing to apply pressure to your opponent. Next, we want to talk about 3-betting for value versus a solid player. So just hands we see as value hands versus their range, which under the gun, this would apply in full ring games. So if you're under the gun +1 or 2, and they're opening from the first position, you're 3-betting with ace queen suited plus and tens plus. Some of these are perfectly fine to flat. Again, this is not set in stone. These are just would be value hands versus their range if you punched these hands in versus their overall range. Ace queen suited plus, ace queen offsuit, nines plus from the hijack, ace 10 suited plus, king queen suited plus, ace jack, ace plus. It's about 4 to 8% of our range here from the cutoff, and we add even more hands in the button. Again, not set in stone. These are still value hands versus a range. It depends where their opening range raise is coming from. But some of these are fine flatting some of the time, even folding, like ace 5 or 8 9 offsuit. Especially under the gun raise by your solid regular. You're not gonna flat call with ace 9 offsuit. You're gonna basically be 3-betting or folding. Usually folding in that particular scenario if they open from the cutoff. more heavily towards three betting than folding, and so on as we get to the small blind, ace 8 offsuit, ace 4 suited. So again, this depends where their opening is coming from. The later it comes from, the more of these ranges you're adding in as a value range. That doesn't mean that you have to always three bet them, but they are hands that will play well against their position, whether they, if they do call. A lot of them, if they're four betting, you're obviously folding. You're not going to town with ace 8 offsuit or anything like that. You're just looking to primarily pick up the pot pre-flop and, or look to apply extra pressure because uh, pressure at a poker table creates tension, and tension is what starts to make players make incorrect decision or bad decisions, and that's what you want to do as a poker player. So again, this is suggested range as a generality. We're not covering every single position. If your opponent opens from middle position in a full ring game, you're not going to be always three betting ace 9 offsuit from the button. Sometimes and depends on several dynamics, how active you've been, how active they've been, and so on. But this is a general guideline. So let's talk a bit about three betting light, and we want to talk a bit about the most profitable situations, which are generally in position, and that is because we will increase our fold equity. Our opponents aren't going to be as inclined to call, knowing that they'll have to play a re-raised pot versus us out of position. You'll have initiative going into all the post-flop streets, and so that generally creates the most profitable situation, and that's our ideal scenario to start from. So let's talk a little bit about a general example, something that will happen a lot in games that you can apply to most situations, and talk a little bit about hand ranges here. Um, so a 24-21 player opens in the cutoff for 2.5 big blinds, and we're on the button. So our opponent's hand range is going to look something like this: ace 8 plus, ace deuce suited plus, king 10, so on. You can see their hand range. And our bluffing part, our three betting light range, will look something like this: ace 6 suited plus, ace deuce suited plus, ace 5 offsuit, so on. That's roughly 6% of hands. So that doesn't mean that you have to always three bet light with these hands. This is just a range of hands that can be used, and it can be scaled back or even scaled up. The most important point here is that we want to balance our range, and as a general rule, have a 2-to-1 bluff to value ratio, so that our opponent is basically more indifferent to whether they should be four bet bluffing or not. So this exact ratio depends on how much we're raising and our opponent's raising and so on, what their calling frequencies are, because they're not always going to four bet bluff or fold. They're going to sometimes call, but this is just a general rough rule that if we take roughly 6% of our hands as a bluff, we want to have around 3% of our hands that are going to be for value. So you can see how this would scale if we increase that to 8, and then we want to get our value range around 4 and so on, whereas we scale it down vice versa. So but in general, we want to do it with hands that have some post-flop potential. That if we flop top pair, we could possibly get to showdown, which when we're in position, we generally have more control of how many of these hands are going to go to showdown. Can flop some flushes. There's some straight potentials, things of that nature that will, when we are called, will allow us to have a hand that we're happy about. Um, you know, so you can three bet light with any hand, ace, deuce, offsuit, or whatever, and there could be even profitable situations to do that. Say you've been playing mini rotations and you really haven't played any hand, and someone's been playing a lot of hands, a regular, but they show that they're not a total maniac and they'll fold. You could find an argument for three betting 9-3 suited or something, but in general, this is a good range of hands to kind of start with, to add if you're not three betting light a whole lot. and then kind of work out from there. Just keep in mind if you want to stay consistent with your three betting range. If you're playing a lot of regulars, you don't want to three bet with your value range, say in this exact example, 9 or 10 big blinds, and then you three bet light, 8 big blinds or something. You want to stay a consistent amount, whatever that is. If you decide you want to three bet around 9 big blinds, then you stay consistent with that. Especially against your regulars players you're going to be playing a lot with. Against fish, you can vary this, but this is generally a good strategy to employ against most of your regulars, to where you are applying pressure to them. You're getting them to potentially make mistakes, and you're increasing your ability to pick up pots that you maybe not wouldn't have otherwise. And speaking of balance, I want to speak a little bit about what balance looks like realistically in your typical games and how you build history with opponents. You should always be focusing on an exploitative play in poker. That's the general overall goal, and that is that you're looking for holes, weaknesses in your opponent's game, and then you are figuring out ways to capitalize on those. So if your opponent is folding to three bets too often, then you are widening your three bet range. Your three bet light range is getting wider and wider, and you're exploiting the fact that your opponent is folding too often to three bets. So that's a basic, simple example. That's what you should be doing overall. Now, if you don't have history with your opponent, then a good baseline to work from is game three optimal strategy. So that is that you're looking for lines that your opponent has no way of exploiting themselves. So you should be doing this in general, and learning and understanding game three optimal play, so that anytime you recognize that your opponents are also not ideally playing those lines, you know how to exploit them. So it works twofold, and that if you are executing properly, your opponents won't be able to exploit you. But when you notice your opponent is not playing optimally, you'll know what that looks like, and then you'll know what you should be doing to exploit that and to win more hands against them. So in general, game theory optimal approach should be a strategy that you're using more against your regulars and against players that are showing that they're capable of understanding hand ranges, and that you need to have a balanced strategy in order to be profitable or hold your own against them. There are regulars that are really, really bad out there that you won't have to do that as much. Again, that comes down to looking for areas to exploit them. So, um, one of those areas is when your opponent has some busted bluffs, and you've busted, you've tried to bluff against your opponent, and you got caught. You want to make sure you're making notes on those things, because those are also going to build history that you can use later on down the line. And you use that based on understanding that your range is going to get perceived to be wider if you are bluffing, especially if it was in a pretty narrow spot. Those are things that you want to make sure later on, as you play and you build more and more history, you can use that information. All those go into factoring how much you're looking to balance, or how much you're looking to play an exploitative style. So again, in general, exploitative play is always your goal in poker, and game theory optimal approach is creating a baseline for you to understand how to play in a manner that you can't be exploited by your opponents. Moving right into whiff flops as a three better. So if you three bet as a bluff and you whiffed, or you three bet with a value hand like ace queen and you whiffed, you do want to three bet a higher frequency when you're in position versus out of position. Again, reasons are obvious, or should be obvious, that you have information with your opponent having checked, and you have the threat of betting more on later streets, so your opponent has to make a lot tougher decisions when you do bet. Now, when you three bet and whiff with a good value hand, ace king, ace queen, you need to make some decisions about your opponent's calling range, and whether you don't want to check to induce a bluff on the turn, or you just want to check to control the pot because you're still ahead of their range. There's a lot of different factors, board texture and stuff like that. But with some of those value hands, you don't always have to c bet. But with some of your three bet bluffs that you completely whiffed, you don't really have a whole lot of outs, looking to just bet and take down the pot right there on the flop is generally a good strategy. Having said that, your c bet sizing should be half pot or less. One third pot is also a good general strategy, especially against regulars. A lot of opponents don't play very well to smaller three bets, and you can use that to set up a turn bet also, so you're double barreling in a higher frequency. There's a lot of reasons to keep kind of a smaller size as a three better. That being said, you should be breaking up what your strategy is going to be based on your kind of opponent types overall. You should have groups of kind of regs and like good regs, okay regs and stuff, where you're taking maybe a one third pot c bet strategy, maybe slightly less, half pot, maybe even more against some of the fishy opponents, especially if you hit a big hand in those re-raise pots. You can really size up your bets. You should never just kind of auto stick a size in there. That's just not an ideal profitable strategy. Against maniacs, when you hit, you should be betting really large because they tend to be non-believers, and they'll pay off more bets, especially on the flop. People will pay off more bets on the flop than on the turn in the river. So keep all those factors in mind and make sure you're adjusting your c bet size in general. Um, Out of position, take a more conservative approach. If you have some overcards and backdoor draws, things of that nature, you can look to c bet. Um, but you should, especially as you're starting, take a little bit more of a one and done approach when you're out of position. As you gain more experience and you understand your opponents and the flop textures and what you can represent, you can kind of become more aggressive and look double barrel a little more often, even triple. But until as you're first kind of getting your feet wet in the strategy, I suggest kind of a larger size, out of position, one and done type approach, and then size it up from there. And then you can go even from going down to a one third c bet strategy when you whiff, and then betting a little bit over half pot on the turn. It's another effective starting strategy and kind of getting an overall bluffing frequency going and understanding how to turn a pot that you might not otherwise win into a winnable pot. But start with the basics and always work out from there. Now, what should you look to do if you're the caller in a three bet pot and you whiffed? As a general strategy, you should be betting at a very high frequency when you're in position. Even with some of your value range, if you decide to just call with ace king, ace queen type hands, you should bet at a pretty high frequency here, because if you can get your opponents to fold that same range of hands, that's huge for you. That being said, that doesn't mean you always bet those hands. If your opponent checks you on a highly coordinated board, like a 6, 7, 8, 2 club board, you should be betting nearly pretty much 100% of your range there, because they are generally check folding in that spot. It's very few times their opponent's going to check there. They're either check folding most of the time and occasionally check raising. And if they check raise and you ended up checking the flop, they're going to bet the turn anyways. So you might as well use the power position and take a stab and bet in that situation. And most of the time, you're going to take down that pot. Out of position, you just got to be a lot more conservative and look for situations where you have two overcards that are good. And otherwise, you should be giving up in a lot of situations. As you become more advanced and more comfortable, you can look for situations where you can check raise versus certain opponents or represent certain hands and certain ranges of hands. But as a starting strategy, just check fold if you whiff. Occasionally, you should be calling with two overs, especially on non-coordinated boards. The same thing applies to you. If it's highly coordinated, you shouldn't be check calling with two overs. You should either be just taking a stab at that pot and kind of donking into your opponent or giving up. Now, if you are in position and you're bet into, then you should be folding a whole lot, with the exception if you have a couple overs or you have some backdoor draws. Any of those scenarios that you feel you can potentially outplay your opponent later, those are situations that you can look to float in position. Out of position, it should be really minimal. So let's take a look at a really common example here. So you open in the cutoff 2.5 big blinds with ace of hearts, queen of diamonds. It folds the small blind who three bets to 10 big blinds and you call. So the flop comes, and the pot's 21 big blinds, deuce of hearts, five of hearts, jack of clubs. So basically it's a pretty blank flop. The small blind c bets 11 big blinds and you call. So a couple of reasons that we're calling here. Two, backdoor straight draws with deuce and five, and with ace in our hand, we have a couple runners there for a straight, and the same with the jack with having the ace queen. There's a couple runners there. There's two overcards, and there's a backdoor flush draw, nut flush draw with the ace of hearts. So all of those, that's an automatic call in that scenario, not to mention that you should still be slightly ahead of your opponent's three betting range in that situation. Again, if we look back at what a small blind's three betting range is going to be there, it's going to include, dominated aces, ace five, or sorry, ace six. They have ace five, they have a pair, ace six, you know, uh, king 10, all these kinds of hands. We're still ahead of the range, so we'll be calling because we have an equity advantage and we have all these backdoor draws. So that's an auto call as a example of when you don't make a pair but you still have an equity edge. So let's talk about one more play, squeeze play, and then we're out of here. So squeeze is anytime someone open raises, another player cold calls, and you three bet squeezing the original open raiser. So the original open raiser is the person who is all the pressure is being applied to. They are squeezed because they have to decide if the person who cold called after them is maybe trapping with a big hand, might four bet. They don't know what that person's doing, so they're really put in a tough situation and they have to make a difficult decision, which is what you want to do in poker. You want to make your opponents make difficult decisions. So as always, we want to look at the most profitable spots, which is going to be versus a loose opener and a cold caller that can fold, or a cold caller who is just a bad player, a fishy player, someone that you can outplay. Those are the most ideal opponents to squeeze. And if you do it correctly, a squeeze play is quite profitable. So an ideal spot, a very profitable spot, is versus an open button and a small blind caller, and you're in the big blind. That is ideal because we know almost all situations are open button. It's going to have a wide range. Our small blind is going to be in a situation where they're going to be out of position post flop if they decide to call. So, most regulars will understand this, so keep that in mind also, that if you are the big blind and your small blind happens to be a regular, then you need to be aware that they could possibly be trapping too, especially if you've been three betting a lot in your game. It's a good situation to trap if you're that regular, is to just cold call with a pretty big hand, hope that the big blind goes squeeze happy, and then you can spring a trap. So squeeze sizing in general should be roughly about 4 times what the open raise size is, slightly more out of position unless you're deep versus at an open original raiser. In that case, really you should only be three betting as a squeeze for value. Your bluffing range should really go down a whole lot there. Ideally, you want to be looking for around 120 big blinds to 80 big blinds, maybe a little bit less, to squeeze as a bluff. So outside of that, most of your squeezes should be for value or with big suited hands. So 8-7 suited, 9-10 suited, Jack-10 suited, those kinds of hands go up in value as a squeeze deep. But as always, you want to be selective. So let's take a look at an ideal scenario. This one is a regular open raises on the button in a 6 max cash game. This person is 23-20. They open to 2.5 big blinds, and the small blind, a bad player who is 37-12, calls, and we're in the big blind with ace of spades, five of spades, and we squeeze to 11.5 big blinds. So as you can see, the squeeze size is a little bit over 4 times. That's roughly around where I would squeeze in this scenario out of position, around 11 to 12 big blinds. Kind of depends on the opponent who's opening, how much I feel like I need to increase fold equity versus them or not. But that is a scenario that you want to increase a slight amount. Like if you were 3 betting as a squeeze on the button, you can size this down to roughly 4 times because the same scenario is going to apply, that the player who open raise is going to have to make a decision. If they were open from middle position and a cutoff call and you squeeze them on the button, the sizing isn't going to matter as much because they're going to be out of position throughout the whole hand, possibly out of position versus 2 opponents, so the sizing is not quite as relevant to still have a fold equity, assuming that's what you want. And in this example with ace of suited, five of suited, we're totally happy with just taking down the pot pre-flop. But if a call happens, generally it's going to be versus the bad player in the small blind. Usually you're going to have the button fold, and either the small blind is going to call or fold. Either scenario is usually pretty good. So that's a good scenario to start with some squeezes as bluffs. For value, it's pretty straightforward. You have a value hand, you 3-bet squeeze, you're looking for as much profit as you can get in that situation. So in summary, we want to 3-bet for a few different reasons: to isolate weak players, apply pressure to the regulars in our games, and for value. Suggested minimum 3-bet size around 2.5 to 3 times our opponent's open raise size. Now, out of position could be a little bit more if you want to increase fold equity, but when you're deep, you should stick to roughly the same 3-bet size out of position, because most of those hands, the sizing will go slightly down in EV when your opponent has position. We want to polarize our 3-betting range, so we want to have a roughly equal amount of value hands to bluffs and mix that in so we have a good balanced approach. In 3-bet pots, we should be sizing down our c-bet sizing. So if our standard c-bet size in a single raise pot is roughly 2/3 or slightly under 2/3, it should be max about half pot or less in a 3-bet pot, and always adjust based on your opponents. We should be looking to call c-bets on our whiff flops much more frequently when we have some backdoor draws, over cards, and things of those natures. That's areas that we can float profitably, and usually we're ahead of our opponent's range in general, so we should be calling at a higher frequency. And lastly, we want to 3-bet squeeze roughly 4 times our open raise size. Unless we're out of position, we can increase that slightly. Again, everything, it depends. These are general overall rules that work well in just about all games. So I hope this video has helped you, and I know it's going to make you a more thoughtful 3-better, and good luck at the tables.